Nope.
Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with David Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Got a lovely day here, and I know you're not too far away from me, so you must be enjoying a lovely day too.
No, we are, and it's very, very nice here. I'm a little confused. It looks like you're in the middle of England or someplace
Yeah,
like
I
that.
move. I move around a lot. I have
Uh,
very many residences with profoundly large libraries, and I notice your halo's gone today.
yeah, well, you can't be good all the time, I guess.
I won't ask about what you've been doing, where you lost your halo. So I just hope on a future episode or so, maybe you'll get it back. We'll just leave it at that.
Anyway,
I never had one. Let's just say I never had one to start with, so I can't even understand what it means to lose a halo. And I've never gained one. Never started with one anyway. All right,
I'm
we got a
Dave.
show today, don't we? Or what are we doing?
Yeah, what we're going to do today, folks, is we're going to look at, well, this is One Work, Five Questions, of course. We're on episode 65. And what we are going to be looking at today is Jefferson on his the issue of American exceptionalism that we is discernible in his letter to Alexander von Humboldt in 8 December 1813. And we'll get into who exactly was Humboldt and what Jefferson had to say and what was said between the two of them. And what does it mean altogether within the context of the times? So without further ado, let me introduce Mark. Mark, most people I'm sure know who you are. You hold a PhD in history and philosophy. You've taught at several universities, including the University of Pittsburgh in Michigan, Rutgers in Camden. I assume that's not where Bob Cratchit lives, and that's out of London, right? That's the
No,
Camden
no,
in New
no.
Jersey. Okay,
So
I just
is that suggestion that I'm living in a Cratchit life residence here?
well, that was the next question.
Well, I only
No,
Cratchit had so many books. I don't think he had any books. I'm not even sure Scrooge had too many books.
no, and poor Cratchit, all he was a clerk, and I guess he was making copies of business transactions.
He
So,
was no clerk. He was a clerk,
Clark, exactly.
as
That's right.
As the
Amen.
Brits say it.
So, but anyway, you're no Clark nor a clerk because you have written over 27 books on Thomas Jefferson and his life and times and hundreds of articles. So, without further ado, let's go ahead with the first question. And let's put this one to bed right away. Who exactly was Alexander von Humboldt?
Yeah, we start with a question generally like that. If we have an interlocutor, correspondent that we think with whom readers might be unfamiliar, the obvious first question is always going to be some brief biographical description about his correspondent. Von Humboldt was a younger contemporary of Jefferson. He was born in 1769, Jefferson 1743. He passed away, lived to be 90, passed away in 1859. He was a natural philosopher, explorer, geographer, botanist, geologist, and polyhistor. Polyhistor is a person who just knows a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. Now, let me bring up, by the way, the cigar I'm smoking is a Kentucky fire-cured little miniature, and it's very similar to the sort of cigars that they would have made in Lynchburg at the time, when Lynchburg was the tobacco capital of the world. It's a flavored cigar, and Lynchburg had made the best cigars in the world in terms of flavor, not necessarily in quantity. But I bought these especially because they're supposed to be very similar to the sort of cigars that were made in Lynchburg at the time. But I like these a lot. And so much for that. I don't think that tells us much about who von Humboldt was. I want to pick up a share screen here and start with a picture of von Humboldt so all the readers can see who he was, right? So that's a picture of him, and let me get rid of that, put up another picture. This is where von Humboldt, his travels, and if I could make that larger, does that work here? Right. You see
Yeah,
that? Does that come up, Dave? Or
Yeah, we're closer to Mexico now, going across the Atlantic, so that works.
Does the whole thing come up? That's what I want to
Yes,
know.
yeah, it's in there.
Okay,
You
so I
got
mean,
everything.
you can
You got
see he
everything.
travels from 1799 to the New World. So he's an explorer, but he's also a natural philosopher. He's a scientist, wants to know as much as he can about the geography, the climate, the biota, in other words, the life, plant and animal life, and things like that. So he's a very fascinating person, and it's no weird thing that he should befriend Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson him. So, he travels, as you can see from this map, from 1799 to 1804 to the northern part of South America, and he travels around there. And then he goes to Cuba and parts of Mexico. And then toward the end of his trip, he goes to visit his old buddy in Washington. Goes to Philadelphia first, and no doubt stops at the American Philosophical Society, and then he makes his way to see his buddy Thomas Jefferson. What precisely they talked about, we don't know. One could imagine, but the letter here might give you some idea of what they talked about. You can imagine being a fly on the wall during that conversation. So as
Oh
his,
my Lord!
I'm sorry.
I said, oh my Lord, that would be just an education in and of itself.
Yeah, it'd be great. I just have from a letter, May 28, 1804. He said, "No one perhaps views this new world," this is Jefferson talking, "with more partial hopes of its exhibiting an ameliorated state of the human condition." So Thomas Jefferson is writing and speaking of the new world, namely the United States part to play in the new world. He has hopes that this is going to be, as he says, an ameliorated state of human conditions. It's going to be a better state. We're going to be farmers. We're not going to be engaged in the broils of Europe and war and all these other sorts of things. We're going to be producing food for all people of the world, if anybody else in the world wants it. So I mean, there's much more to say, but with respect to the letter here, that's all we really need to know. He was a polyhistor.
And I know this is not a question that we talked about ahead of time, but it kind of piqued my interest about Humboldt. I assume that he was pretty much a student of the German Enlightenment more so than the Anglo-Scottish and American. Is that fair to say?
I think that's correct. I'm not an expert on von Humboldt, but from learning about his early career, he was educated in the German tradition. So, yeah, he's in that line of thought. That seems fair enough.
Okay. Ready for question two?
I guess so.
Okay. What is Jefferson's overall assessment of what he calls New Spain? And as people can see on the map, that's basically, the Southwest United States, including now California, Mexico, and most of Central America, with the possible exception of what is now Panama. In those days, it was part of New Grenada, which actually was now what we know of as Panama and Colombia and parts of Venezuela, I believe, and Ecuador. So pretty big area. But anyway,
no
New
canal
Spain.
then. Well, he
I'm sorry?
writes, no canal
tough
then.
as it can.
But there was a time where canals were pretty big things, so no surprise that there would be a canal in time. I just go to his letter. One thing to say is that Jefferson is going to talk about, I don't want to say a multiplicity of things, but maybe about 4 or 5 different things in the letter. And if you read carefully, there's a thread to it. All of it deals with what I call American exceptionalism. In other words, not getting involved in the affairs of Europe, in doing something to ameliorate the state of the human condition in the New World. And he's speaking not only of the North American continent, hopefully the South American continent. So if you go back to the map on New Spain, he this is in the throng of the letter is written in 1813. The Mexican Revolution is in the offing and has begun. There's skirmishing and fighting around as early as 1810, and the revolution will continue at 1821. And so this concerns Jefferson, right? Um, he talks, I'm going to read right from the letter when he talks about New Spain. Talks to von Humboldt. He says, I think it most fortunate that your travels in those countries were so timed as to make them known to the world in the moment that they were about to become actors on its stage. So he's talking about how precipitous it was and how von Humboldt's right on the ball to go there, you know, just prior to this revolution and so forth. And this should, I mean, the cherry viewer, listener will be keep in mind, back in mind, just the extent to which, you know, when the American Revolution comes off successfully, a revolution for the sake of human freedom and liberty, this is going to give rise to revolutions all over the world, where people fighting on behalf of liberty and freedom for self-determination and government of and by the people. So he talks about, I think it's most fortunate who travels to those countries so timed as to make them known to the world in the moment they're about to become actors, that they will throw off their European dependence, I have no doubt. So he's talking about, okay, we're going to get rid of, all the revolutions are for the sake of fighting against the sort of aristocratic governments that you had, mainly of the monarchical sort that you have in Europe at the time. But he says, in what kind of government the revolution will end is not so certain. So he's throwing a monkey wrench here. He says, history, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their civil as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes. The vicinity of New Spain to the U.S. and their consequent intercourse may furnish schools for the higher and example for the lower classes of their citizens. So it's sort of an ambivalent reception here. They're fighting a revolution for the sake of liberty and self-government. They're going to do something that, you know, the governments in Europe are not doing, but yet the Spanish people are incurably religious, incurably Catholic. And so if you're going to have a revolution fought for the installation of a government that is wedded to a particular religious denomination, Jefferson says this is a recipe for disaster, because you can't have free government that is wedded to one particular sect of a religion. And so he's hopeful, but yet he's not hopeful. He says, in Mexico, where we learned from you that men of science are not wanting, may revolutionize itself under better auspices than the southern provinces, right? Talking about south of Mexico, South America. These last, I fear, must end in military despotisms. The different castes of their inhabitants, their mutual hatreds and jealousies, their profound ignorance and bigotry will be played off by cunning leaders, and each be made the instrument of enslaving the others. Then he goes on to say, well, you know better than I, you've been there. He's talking about South America, the northern part of South America. And the most important passage for me, at least, is what follows. He says, but in whatever governments they end, they will be American governments, no longer to be involved in the never-ceasing broils of Europe. That meaning that even though if they are despotisms, they're going to at least be American, South American, North American despotisms. And so in some sense, we're not going to be involved, even if they are wedded to Catholic religion, whatever, we're not going to be involved in the broils and the problems of Europe. So that's a good thing. The European nations constitute a separate division of the globe, separated by the broad, as you can see, Atlantic Ocean, which is what? About the United States is what? About 3,000 miles across. So the Atlantic Ocean at the narrowest is probably about 3,000 miles across, that's narrowest part, right?
Yeah, I would think so, roughly.
Yeah. He says their localities make them part of a distinct system. They have a set of interests of their own in which it is our business never to engage ourselves. America has a hemisphere to itself. It must have its separate systems of interest, which must not be subordinated to those of Europe. The insulated state in which nature has placed the American continent should so far avail it that no spark of war kindled in the other quarters of the globe should be wafted. I love that wafted metaphors, Thomas. Across the wide oceans would separate us from them, and it will be so. This is the famous, notice how Jefferson snuck in that metaphor, famous Monroe Doctrine. Monroe will, whatever's going to happen here, whatever problems we have with despotic governments and so forth, there'll be American autocracies, at least, not be interested in the broils, in the quarrels of Europe. So that is a good thing. And so, I don't know what to say with that other than that. So I think what I get out of this is this very distinct statement about American exceptionalism, right? And that what we get. Gosh, to have a cell phone, these are bothersome. Don't like.
It's kind of interesting that when he's talking about New Spain and contiguous parts of Latin America, that he sees that they have a connection to Europe, but moving in a different direction, perhaps. But at the same time, they still have, even in that time, that European flavor to them, at least in the leadership and the high society, for lack of a better term. Arguably, we did too in those days. We still had, a lot of British ideas here. We still do. Others would to follow. But wow, kind of interesting, isn't
it? It is. I mean, it's hard not to take what you can from the mother country with you to the new world. But Gordon Wood has written on this, I think, quite capably, where he talks about one of the things you don't have is you don't have the classes that you have. You don't have in America, what you don't have is the broad division between the haves and the have-nots, as you see, especially in France, where you have the elite people who don't even work because they're propertied and they own wealth and it's passed on from generation to generation. Then you have the other people who are the penurious, the extremely impoverished, who barely scrape by on a daily basis. And they're in the majority and they have no land on which to live. Basically.
You're talking about France of the 18th century?
Yeah, 18th century, early 19th century, Jefferson's time.
Yeah.
Jefferson made a tour of France and he looked at the impoverished people and was sort of astonished that he makes the comment, well, it's sort of disgusting that the property people, the aristocrats, have so much land and they won't share it with people who don't have it because they need it for hunting and for whatever purposes. And he thought it was a colossal waste. So, you don't have the classes. And in America, everybody has why it's called the land of opportunity, and rightly so. Everybody has an opportunity to make something of himself. Anybody can get land because they have land aplenty. If you're willing to, if you have to move west or whatever. So there's land aplenty and you can make something of yourself. So you have a different sort of, if you have any sort of classes in America, they're sort of based on property and wealth in that regard. The people who make something of themselves and the people who don't.
You could argue that's quite a profound idea in that era, because as you mentioned, wealth to a large extent was understood as being tied up into real estate, land basically. And what did we do early on as a nation? We created the Northwest Territories, and we started encouraging people to move out west and taking on land. That was, I can't think of an example in Europe where something like that occurred. Now, maybe it did in small pockets, and but they didn't. Yeah,
they didn't have the land.
They didn't have the land, but even if they did have some, but it seems to me that it was, like you said, it was conquest and intrigue, and then it fell into place with a handful of perpetually wealthy, entitled people, and that was it. France in the 18th century, around the time of the Revolution, I read that 90% of the population was what we would understand as impoverished.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's why I said France, especially.
Yeah.
If you want to see the state of England or London at the time, just see A Christmas Carol, the movie, or read Dickens. Read Dickens' works, any of his novels, and you give an idea of the people who have and have not. And a lot of the people working in factories, children working, families just scraping by just to make a living and so forth, while the industrialists, quote unquote, call them later, we'll see, are doing quite well for themselves. So, yeah, and that the idea is there didn't really have to be too much incentive for people to move west, because people like Alexander Hamilton were investing in land and so forth, and a lot of people were buying land to the west with the hopes that it's going to be peopled at some point. And once peopled, they could sell it to property, people owning property or businesses owning property who want to sell it off to. So, I mean, land itself was a highly profitable business at some point.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that, or should we move on to 3?
Yeah, move on to 3, I guess. I'm going to get rid of the screen share here so they can see your face, Dave, again. And
oh, okay. I would rather see the map, but that's okay. Not you, me. I mean,
yes.
Anyway, what are the key takeaways regarding Jefferson's discussion of population growth?
Well, he writes of this. I mean, it's sort of interesting because I was reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, beat up thrift books, copy, whatever. And he has an essay in 1751, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind and the Peopling of Countries and so forth. A lot of people. Jean-Baptiste Say is talking about it. Other people are talking about the peopling of the globe, right? Because you've got colonies forming all over the globe, in North America, in Australia, and so forth, in India. And Europe is, in some sense, overpeopled, and countries are looking to colonize other areas that are not overpeopled, in underexplored areas, like I said, Australia and North and South America. So, Jefferson is always concerned with, we've got this. If you go back to the map, I'll bring that up again. I hate to do this too much, but you can see we have this vast array of land here. He's writing this letter well after the Louisiana Purchase, and there in Spain itself might claim all this land here, but it can't really defend it because there are not enough Spanish people in the area to defend it. And all this territory up here is up for grabs, outside of the Louisiana Purchase that you have here. But all this other area, in some sense, there are French and British in Canada, and populated by French and British, but it's still up for grabs, and no one really claiming it. So we have, we have this interest in populational stuff here. So going back to, what Jefferson says, he says in 50 years more, the U.S. alone will contain 50 millions of inhabitants, and 50 years are soon gone over. He talks of the peace of 1763, which was the end of the French and Indian War. 7 years war occurring in it is within that period. I was then 20 years old, and of course remember all the transactions of the war preceding it, and you will live to see the epoch now equally ahead of us, and the numbers which will then spread. I don't want to go into read the rest of it. The idea is that we have all this land, not enough people, so we have this abundancy of untapped resources in the new world, and we need to, make babies. We need more people to settle the land, and Jefferson wants to see this. He wants to see all this land being Jeffersonian republics at some point. That's a dream of his, and he says at some point, I don't really care he doesn't really want to see the Spanish people for the reason I just said, because they line up their government with a particular religion, and that's a recipe for failure when it comes to free Jeffersonian Republican government, right? You can't line, the government should not be partnered with any particular religion, because that's going to cause all sorts of difficulties with people who believe otherwise or people who don't believe. So, the thing is, and Franklin writes this essay, and people are talking about, Malthus writes his thesis that inspired Darwin, where Malthus says something to the effect that we can produce food arithmetically, meaning additively, whereas populations grow, they multiply.
Yes, exactly.
If I start with 2 bits of food, 2 bits of people, 2 units of people, in a certain amount of time, I add 2 more, I get 4. I multiply 2, I get 4. I add 2 more, I get 6 over another period. I multiply 4 by 2, I get 8. And you can see how there's less and less food for more and more people, right? So you've got this problem, and Jefferson solves that problem saying we have a lot of land. That's not going to bother us. He writes to John Baptiste, say, don't worry about that, America. We have a lot of land. We can feed the world. He's not looking, 300 years down the road when it's oversettled or whatever. So, he's like other people just talking about the ability. The main thing to get behind that is Jefferson thinks that in North America, we're going to have a capacity to have more people, more babies, because people have property. And when you have property, you have wealth. When you have wealth, you can have a family. Whereas in Europe, if you're working in a factory, or you penurious in France, you can't really start a family until you can provide for them.
Yeah. Okay. We got question 4, and that is Jefferson mentions the Aboriginals, what we would understand as Native Americans. What are Jefferson's main points, and how do they tie into his broader discussions with Humboldt?
Well, I have a book coming out shortly on Jefferson's Native American policy. I'm very proud of that book. Another book, when I write books on Jefferson, I usually don't arbitrarily start a topic. I start a topic because it's something I don't know, something about which I know little or too little. Same thing with Jefferson and Native Americans. I had read Wallace's book and other books, but so I wrote a book on that, and it was fascinating. And his policies were no different than George Washington's before him, and Henry Knox, his secretary. He says, my friend, the benevolent plan we were pursuing here for the happiness of the aboriginal inhabitants in our vicinities, we spared nothing to keep them at peace with one another, to teach them agriculture and the rudiments of the most necessary arts, and to encourage industry by establishing among them separate property. In this way, they would have been enabled to subsist and multiply on a moderate scale of landed possession, in other words, being farmers. They would have mixed their blood with ours, miscegenation, and been amalgamated and identified with us within no distant period of time. On the commencement of our present war, we pressed on them the observance of peace and neutrality. Now, Jefferson is speaking of this in some respects as a failed policy. The policy was not uniquely Jeffersonian. It was the same policy that George Washington adopted. We wanted to be on amicable terms with the Native Americans, but you can't just lump the Native Americans together because there's so many different tribes. And just, to say that Native Americans, well, they're all over North and South America, and they had many different cultural distinct practices. So right off the bat, to lump them all together is not doing justice to the Native Americans. And more than that, it's not doing justice to the sort of problems we encountered. Some peaceable tribes, some warlike tribes, some very barbaric practices, scalping, torturing of prisoners of war, some very humane practices. The Native Americans in general had very beautiful views about the land and living off the land, not abusing it. One letter is by an Indian warrior chief who talked about, you want us to be farmers, but that is like asking us to stick a knife in our mother's bosom and cut her open. And, we certainly don't think of working the land as being a bad thing. Jefferson didn't, but they did. The land was a resource. So the idea is ideally, as Jefferson writes in one letter, that the numbers of white people are growing and growing and growing. It's like a tide, and it's moving. There's nothing going to stop it at the frontiers. The frontiers keep expanding. In effect, the policy is Native American people can either join and become agricultural. The problem with that is the Native Americans didn't want to do that. They wanted to maintain their own culture within American society, even if they became farmers, but still go on hunting and doing some of the same things. And that's not what American politicians wanted them. They had to be completely Americanized or nothing at all. So that was part of the problem. And, you see what happened today. It was a failed policy.
Now, I was wondering about how that connected, for example, to the time of Andrew Jackson when he was president and came up with what became the Trail of Tears.
Yes.
There were complexities involved in that, and I wonder if they were traceable back to some of the ideas of the Jeffersonian time. I don't mean in a bad or good way, just in historical connection.
That's a very good point you brought up. Jackson is customarily chastised for the Trail of Tears enforcing. One of the things, my dog is jumping. You coming up? Come on.
Yeah, we're down to 7 minutes too, by the way, just to let you know.
I see. But one of the things that one of the things that Jackson should be applauded for, I believe, he actually adopted one or two Native Americans as children. People don't know that, but he wanted to be honest with the natives, right? He didn't really give a damn about moving them out and so forth. That much must be noted, but it was happening anyway. He just wanted to be, okay, this is what's going on. You can either do what we want you to do, Americanize, whatever, or we're going to move you the hell out. We're going to force you to move. And that was happening anyways in rather subtle ways. He was at least open about what we were doing with the natives. So whatever you want to say about him, he was open and honest about what had been going on prior to his presidency. Maybe a little bit too open and forthcoming to the expense. We know how many thousands and thousands of Native Americans died in transit during Trail of Tears and so forth. That was a good question.
Oh, thank you. You ready for question 5?
I guess so.
And this is our last one. Jefferson alludes to the French and Indian War, and you mentioned that earlier as well, ending in 1763. Why was that such a seminal event in American history? And how does it relate to Jefferson's central points in his letter to von Humboldt?
Well, it piggybacks on what I was saying in answering the last question. This is all about land, American exceptionalism, Americans being farmers, hopefully doing things differently, not involving themselves, opening the doors for Native Americans to join them and actually to intermix with them. That was happening anyway, especially with white settlers with Native American females. It was frowned upon for white women to marry with Native American males. That was looked upon as anathema and disgusting. But if a white male wanted to marry a squaw, he could do that. He says, he's alluding to the French and Indian War, 1754, 1763. The 7-Year Wars was part of that. He says, but the interested and unprincipled policy of England has defeated all our labors for the salvation of these unfortunate people. They have seduced the greater part of the tribes within our neighborhood to take up the hatchet against us, and the cruel massacres they have committed on the women and children of our frontier taken by surprise will oblige us now to pursue them to extermination, about the Native Americans, or drive them to new seats beyond our reach, push them beyond the borders of the Mississippi. Already we have driven their patrons and seducers into Montreal, talking about the British, and the opening season will force them to their last refuge, the walls of Quebec. We have cut off all possibility of intercourse and mutual aid and may pursue at our leisure whatever plan we find necessary to secure ourselves against the future effects of their savagery and ruthless warfare. The confirmed brutalization, if not the extermination of this race in our America, is therefore to form an additional chapter in the English history of the same colored man in Asia and of the brethren of their own color in Ireland and wherever else Anglo-mercantile cupidity can find a two-penny interest in deluging the earth with human blood, flooding the earth with human blood. The idea here, he's blaming the British people for their avarice, their greed in economic intercourse, for negotiating with the natives to turn against the American frontiersmen and so forth, and begin warfare. And of course, this turns the French and Indian War becomes the 7 Years' War, where France, and England go to war. And this has all sorts of implications here. And Jefferson is just, the whole idea with Americans on the frontier and just going into Native American territory is a disaster waiting to happen. There's not going to be any happy outcome. The frontiers people are populating those territories. They're procreating, and the Native Americans need to be moved out, and no good can come from that. So the British are capitalizing on this problem and turning the Native Americans against the colonists. Not a bad idea. And we have all sorts of problems. And Jefferson said this is going to result in pushing them into the farthest recesses of the continent or extermination. And in some sense, that has happened in some sense. We pretty much, it's not that Native Americans have become exterminated, but their culture has been. And that's what Jefferson realized was going to happen, is that if you want to integrate with Americans, your culture has to go. We can't have scalping. We can't have barbarity. You need to open books and all sorts of things. I'm not commenting good or bad one way. That's what the
it's reality of the times.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this letter? I think, to me, it's an interesting letter because everything seems to be threaded, even though he's talking about different things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think there is a central theme to it, absolutely, and connections. I'm not sure I fully grasp all the connections Jefferson was seeing. Not that, part of the problem, I guess, is because he's living in the 18th century or the 19th. We're not. And so things that he's addressing there, uncertainties, maybe assurities within the context of the Enlightenment, so forth and so on, we have a different take on things. So maybe there's part of that. But on the surface, it looks like it's pretty tight to me that he is thinking this strategically, and at the same time, he's seeing the depths and the breadth of individual component parts of that thread, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and he's given, last few comments before we're up here, he's giving part of his political philosophy. American exceptionalism, we need to stay away from what's going on in Europe. They're interested in manufacturing gewgaws and trivial stuff, not important things like plows and stuff that people need. We need to be agricultural, stay away from that influence, and do what we can to work with the problems we have with the Native Americans at the year 1813.
And thank you,